So yeah, this is really special. I'm a Shirtel relative. George and my great-grandfather Leo were brothers, but we have some of what I call George's real family here, his grandkids, the Nile family, that actually knew him. He passed away before I was born, but if you guys want to stand up, thank you for being here. So without George Burns, we're not in this room right now. And the reason I say that is because of his legend, and he has inspired all of the research that Dave Karpinski and I have done across the street that turned into grants, that turned into that turned into this. It's really, it all spider webs. Mr. Charles, would you say the 4 criteria were for the New York State Baseball Hall of Fame?
Sure. Character, professional career, coaching career, and community service.
Okay. So George Burns, he embodies all those to the nth degree. So we'll talk about his baseball career first, right? 15 years in the major leagues. He's in the upper echelons. You've never heard of him, but he's in the top 250 in almost every offensive and defensive category. For the 20,000 people that have played in the major leagues, he's in the top 250 in almost every category. And the reason you don't know about him is they called him Silent George. He was a very unassuming guy. He was 5'6", a little guy. Carried himself professionally, never argued with an umpire. Silent George. So I'll talk about, it's really cool how he started. He was born in Utica in 1889 and then grew up in the St. Johnsville, Little Falls area, about half an hour, 40 minutes west of here. He never played high school or college baseball. He quit high school at age 16 to work in the family's cigar shop. They made cigars and ran pool halls. But he played, sandlot ball, and he played on the St. Johnsville men's kind of semi-pro baseball team or town team. In 1909, at age 19, he goes with his dad, John. They go to attend a Utica Pentups baseball game in Utica. They're part of the New York State League. They pay to go to the game. Before the game starts, it turns out that the starting catcher was injured, and the backup catcher was nowhere to be found, so they couldn't play. And somebody in the crowd had known of his legend, how good he was in local town ball, and they went to him and they got the father, John, to sign a waiver for him to play, or release for him to play that day. So he pays for a ticket to go to the game. He ends up suiting up. He catches. He gets a couple hits. He throws 2 runners out, and he catches 7 pop flies as the catcher. After the game, they sign him to a professional contract, and he finishes out the next 74 games of the season with them. Back in 1910 for the full season. Coming into 1911, a new coach, and when new coaches come, they sometimes have their own guys, and the new coach had his own catcher, so George had a decision to make. They offered for him a spot in the outfield. And as I've talked with Chuck years ago, I used to get all these little stories, and he didn't want to play in the outfield because I think he told you that he always wanted to be involved as much as he could. So if he was a catcher, he was touching the ball all the time. But he reluctantly, I don't even know if it was reluctantly, but he learned how to play center field. That summer, a scout from the Giants was scouting somebody on the other team, and George caught his eye, sends word to John McGraw down in New York, Polo Grounds. McGraw brings him down, watched him play for 10 minutes and signs him. But he told him, he said, Burns was only 21 at the time. He says, we're going to bring you right up to the major leagues because we don't want any other managers messing with you and screwing you up. He goes, I'm going to squeak you into a game here and there, but be patient. I want you to sit back, watch, learn, listen, watch how the players carry themselves, watch how they prepare for games, but always be ready. So the 1911 season, he got into 6 games. The following year, same thing, he got into about 20 games. But in 1913, he sets him loose. He appears in 150 of the 160 games. Finishes starting right fielder and center fielder. He leads the National League in a few categories: hits, at-bats, stolen bases. He finishes 24th in the MVP vote. But back then, the MVP vote was the Chalmers Award. Chalmers was an automobile, and they gave the top player in the league a car. So that's the same year Jim Thorpe was on the Giants. It was battling George for a spot in the outfield. Burns played in 150 games. Jim Thorpe played in 7. So he was not as good at the other sports as Thorpe, but he was better in the outfield. 1914, he finishes 4th for the Chalmers Award. And so basically for the next 10 years, he leads the National League in 26 different offensive categories and 19 different defensive categories for outfielders. So, true to McGraw's word, he sat back, he listened and learned, and he became one of the best outfielders in the game. In 1921, they went to the World Series against the Yankees. So it's the very first Subway Series. Babe Ruth's first World Series as a Yankee. Babe Ruth would only hit 1 home run that whole World Series, and it was in Game 4, and it would have won the game. But little 5'6" George Burns comes up, and late in the game, and hits a bases-clearing double to win the game, and he kind of trumps Babe Ruth. So I joke, the one thing I leave out is that Babe Ruth was injured and wasn't even supposed to play. So he played 1 game and got a home run. But the story I tell is Burns trumped him. So I just get done saying how he led all these categories for the last 10 years. After the World Series, he gets traded to Cincinnati. Back then, at 32, you were considered past your prime, right? You're going to start bringing younger players in. So he gets traded to the Cincinnati Reds. But to show that there was no hard feelings, that it wasn't because of his play, the Giants really respected him. So normally, the Giants won the World Series in 21. They would raise the championship pennant on opening day of the next season. They purposely waited till June until the Reds came to town so George could be there. And they had George Burns Day. And Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who was a real hard guy, the first commissioner of baseball that was brought in to clean up the game, he brought Burns out to home plate and praised his play and praised his character, gave him a diamond-encrusted gold watch. The New York Outdoor Raiders gave him a silver cigarette case. Like, he was just beloved. And then, wearing his Reds uniform, he led the entire Giants team out to center field, and Burns was the one that raised the World Series championship flag. So, very beloved in New York. I would compare him to modern day like a Bernie Williams, a great player, kind of key. A lot of things don't happen without him. So to talk about like community, and he had moved to Gloversville. The Burns family had moved to Gloversville in 1920. They lived over on 95 West Street, and they had a cigar shop and a pool hall down on Main Street. So they became very ingrained in the community. But George was still playing. He had been traded to the Reds, and in 1923, on an off day, he brought the entire Cincinnati Reds team to Gloversville to play an exhibition game against our Elks team. Can anybody guess where that game took place? Right across the street at Parker's Field. And that day he played shortstop, just playing around. And the Reds team, we have a rail trail that John talked about that runs behind here, a path, a walking path. It was a rail line, and that would bring the players through, and they would drop off right behind the ballpark. So in that game, little 5'6" George Burns, and I'll show you one of his bats if you stick around for the presentation after. He hits a home run, over the fence, obviously, over top of people that were standing on the rail cars with their hands up in the air. So had a real good day. But could you imagine today, the Cincinnati Reds or the Pirates or the Mets pulling up here to Little Gloversville and playing the game? It's just pretty cool. Talk about giving back to your community. For the next 2 years, he kind of proved the Giants wrong. He quietly and unassumingly led the National League in a bunch of more categories. He rounded out his major league career in 1926 with the Philadelphia Phillies. But when the smoke settled on his career, he had led the National League in 34 offensive categories and 21 defensive categories. And on the all-time list, like I said, 2,077 hits, that's 253rd all-time. Of the 20,000 men that have suited up and played in the major leagues, only 252 guys have hit more hits than him. And ironically, also tied with 2,077 hits is Hall of Famer Scott Rowland. So if you don't think we're going to be banging that gong, I'm trying to make a case for him for Cooperstown. Rennie, I'm going to ask for your help on this one. I knew what you did for Gil Hodges. But the other categories, you know, played bases, or total bases, walks, run scores, singles, triples. The big stat, he stole home 28 times. And I can only remember that happening. I can only remember somebody stealing home a few times in the last 20 years. Like, it's a big deal. He did it 28 times, and the only two players that did it more were Hall of Famers Max Carey and Ty Cobb. So I mentioned the Hall of Fame case. I have a matrix that I'll show during the presentation where I listed every Hall of Famer, and I listed all the major offensive categories as are tracked by Baseball Reference: hits, games, average, stolen bases, steals at home, strikeouts, you know, the lower being the better. He has at least one stat that's as good or better than every single Hall of Famer that's currently in Cooperstown, with the exception of Ty Cobb. He just can't touch anything Ty Cobb. And ironically, he was asked once who was the greatest, and I'll show this during the presentation, who was the greatest player you ever saw, and he said Ty Cobb. So when he was done with the major leagues, he spent another 5 or 6 years in the minor leagues as a player manager, right? He still wanted to be involved with the game, wanted to start giving back and teaching others and honing the skills of other players. So he, from Massachusetts down to Texas, he was with traveling teams. And then he ended up back in the major leagues in 1931 as a bench coach for the Giants. And I don't know if the Schumacher family made it, but what was kind of neat is I talked with Hal Schumacher once, who played with the Giants from 31 up until just after World War II. He's from Little Falls. And he said when he got to the big leagues, it was so welcoming to have George Burns, who had lived in Little Falls at one time, to be one of his coaches to help him transition. So when his career was over, he came back to Gloversville. He ran the family pool halls and the cigar stores. I've had a lot of guys, you know, 30 years ago that were older then telling me that when they played high school ball, there would be an umpire, but before the games, he'd be out in center field running around, covering the whole outfield, shagging flies, and it was George Burns, and that's what he would do for fun before he umpired a game. He also, as he got older, couldn't be on his feet. He worked with a couple of local leather mills. And the other thing, when we do all of our history research across the street, whenever there was an important game, like if a traveling barnstorming, like Negro League team came, or Cuban team, any professional team that came, Burns was always in the box score. He was always part of that. Part of putting together all the old-timers committees, was constantly promoting the game right up until he passed. So you know, I've kind of alluded, he kind of leaves a legacy, not only of great memories with his family, you know, he's in the upper echelons of the baseball records, but he still leaves an impact on this community. He was inducted into the Utica Hall of Fame in '95, the Fulton County Sports Hall of Fame in 2015. There's an exhibit of his cards and pictures and stuff on his career at the Fulton County Museum, which is across town. And then he's also got an exhibit in the Parker's Field Museum that's across the street. We'll have that open this afternoon if anybody wants to go check it out. And you know, now we're proud to say he's part of the New York State Baseball Hall of Fame.